Picture a Greek philosopher standing on an Atlantic beach at Gades, past the Pillars of Hercules, timing the tide against the moon overhead, and writing down what he sees instead of what tradition says he should see. His name was Posidonius of Apamea, and for a man Cicero called the greatest of the Stoics, almost nobody outside a classics department has heard of him today. Posidonius ran the Stoic school on Rhodes in the 1st century BCE, taught Cicero and Pompey in person, and treated philosophy as something you tested against the actual world, not just argued from a chair. He measured tides at the edge of the known ocean, tried to calculate the size of the Earth itself, studied comets, and wrote a first-hand account of the Gauls decades before Caesar ever crossed into Gaul. And unlike Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, not one of his own books survives complete. Everything you're about to hear comes to us secondhand, through other people's citations. That secondhand transmission runs through some of the biggest names in ancient literature. Cicero quoting his teacher directly, Strabo copying pages of his geography, Seneca still arguing with him a century later. Piece those citations together carefully enough, and a genuinely unusual figure emerges. A Stoic who thought you couldn't understand ethics without going and measuring the world first. Almost nobody remembers his name. Almost everybody who studies the ancient world still uses what he found. We're going to spend this film reconstructing him from fragments. The tides, the measurements, the travels, and the philosophy he built out of all of it. Posidonius was born around 135 BCE in Apamea, in Syria, a crossroads city with no particular reputation for philosophy, and made his way west to Athens to study under the Stoic teacher Panidius. When Panidius died, Posidonius didn't stay in Athens to inherit the school there. He moved instead to Rhodes, a wealthy trading island with its own long tradition of astronomy and rhetoric, and started a school of his own. Rhodes gave him something Athens couldn't: a working port city full of sailors, merchants, and travelers who could hand a curious philosopher firsthand reports from the edges of the Mediterranean world and beyond it. He didn't stay a foreigner there either. Posidonius took Rhodian citizenship, was elected praetanes, the island's chief magistrate, and was later sent to Rome as an official envoy on the island's behalf. That combination is unusual for a philosopher, a working statesman with real diplomatic responsibilities, running a school that drew students from across the Roman world specifically to hear him. Two of those students matter enormously for how we even know his name. A young Roman named Cicero sailed to Rhodes specifically to study under him around 78 BCE, and later called him a friend as well as a teacher. The general Pompey visited Rhodes twice to hear him lecture, and reportedly kept visiting even when Posidonius was seriously ill, a detail we'll come back to. A statesman-philosopher on a small island somehow became one of the most sought-out teachers in the Roman world. Subscribe now, because next Posidonius leaves Rhodes entirely, sails past the edge of the Mediterranean, and stumbles onto the discovery this whole film is really about: the tides. At some point in his travels, Posidonius sailed west to Gades, modern Cadiz, a Phoenician trading post on the Atlantic coast of Spain, past the Pillars of Hercules and out of the Mediterranean entirely. The Mediterranean he'd grown up on barely tides at all. At Gades, he watched the ocean climb and retreat by many feet, twice a day, and he stayed long enough to actually study it. Ancient sailors already whispered that tides tracked the moon, but Posidonius reportedly did something most of them hadn't. He watched daily, monthly, reportedly for the better part of a year, matching the water's rhythm against the moon's phase and position. What he found, preserved through Strabo's geography, was a real pattern: tides swelling largest around new and full moon, smaller at the moon's quarters, rising and falling on a roughly lunar-linked schedule. That makes him one of the first people in the Western tradition to argue, from sustained direct observation, that the ocean's daily rhythm is genuinely governed by the moon overhead. For a Stoic, that finding wasn't just useful sailing knowledge. Stoic physics already claimed the whole cosmos was one interconnected, breathing organism, held together by what they called sympatheia, cosmic sympathy. A visible tug between moon and ocean, measured with his own eyes on a real beach, looked like direct evidence for the very cosmology his philosophy had already committed him to. The empirical fieldwork and the metaphysics weren't separate projects for Posidonius. Each one was there to confirm the other. Comment below if you'd never heard the tide-moon link traced this far back, because next Posidonius turns that same restless habit towards something even bigger, measuring the Earth itself. A century earlier, Eratosthenes in Alexandria had already estimated the Earth's circumference using shadows cast at two cities a known distance apart. Posidonius tried the same basic problem his own way. His method used the bright star Canopus, visible low on the horizon from Rhodes, but reportedly invisible from Alexandria further south, with a known distance between the two cities along roughly the same line of longitude. From that single star's changing angle at two locations, and Rhodes's shipping route distance to Alexandria, Posidonius worked out an estimate for how large a circle the whole Earth must be. Here's where honesty matters. The surviving reports don't even agree with each other. The astronomer Cleomenes, our main source, records two different figures attributed to Posidonius, and they're not close. One version lands remarkably near Eratosthenes' number. The other is dramatically smaller, closer to the undersized Earth that later, more famously, misled Christopher Columbus centuries afterward. We don't actually know which number Posidonius originally reached, or whether Cleomenes preserved a later student's revision instead of the master's own figure. The method survives, the man's precise answer doesn't. That's not a footnote to skip past. It's the honest shape of doing history through fragments. You can recover the method with real confidence and still lose the exact result. What's certain is the ambition. A philosopher trying to put an actual number on the planet he lived on, using nothing but starlight and a ship's sailing log. Tell us in the comments which number you'd bet on, because next Posidonius takes that same fieldwork instinct somewhere no philosopher of his standing had bothered to go, into Gaul itself. Sometime after his Atlantic tides, Posidonius traveled overland through southern Gaul, likely as part of the same long research journey that had already taken him to Spain. Most Greek and Roman writers described the Celts and Gauls from a comfortable distance, recycling second-hand rumor. Posidonius apparently went and looked, recording customs, feasts, and warfare he witnessed or heard firsthand from people who had. What survives, filtered through Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, is startlingly specific. Warriors boasting at feasts, the practice of preserving enemies' severed heads as trophies, druids acting as judges, poets called bards performing for chieftains. Some of it reads as genuinely observed detail. Some almost certainly carries a Greek visitor's own bias about who counted as civilized. Both things can be true of the same ethnographic account. Either way, this fieldwork mattered later. Scholars have long argued that Julius Caesar's own description of Gaul, written decades afterward for a Roman audience, draws directly on material tracing back to Posidonius. That's a strange kind of legacy. A Stoic philosopher's travel notes quietly shaping how the man who conquered Gaul described the people he was conquering, and how later generations pictured them ever since. It also reveals how Posidonius actually worked. Geography, for him, wasn't maps and distances alone. It included the people living inside those distances, studied directly wherever he could manage it. A philosopher's field notes on foreign customs ended up outliving most philosophy written about the Gauls in Posidonius's own century. Hit subscribe before the next scene, because Posidonius isn't done looking either. Comets and storms are next, and for a Stoic, watching the sky was never separate from studying the soul. Posidonius wrote on comets, tracking their movement and disputing the popular belief that they simply predicted disaster, arguing instead that they followed patterns worth studying on their own terms. He studied earthquakes and volcanic activity too, reportedly examining Mount Etna's eruptions in Sicily directly, treating violent natural events as physical processes to investigate rather than omens to merely fear. None of this ran alongside his philosophy as a hobby. For a Stoic, understanding nature accurately was the actual foundation the ethics stood on, because living well meant living according to nature, and you can't follow a law you haven't studied. That's the through line connecting the tides, the Earth's circumference, the comets, and the Gauls. Every observation fed one Stoic claim, that the cosmos is a single rational, interconnected system, and human beings are part of it. A century later, Seneca still can't stop arguing with him. His Natural Questions quotes Posidonius on comets and weather repeatedly, sometimes agreeing, sometimes pushing back hard, treating him as a live opponent, not a dusty authority. That's rare praise in itself. Being disagreed with in detail, generations later, means your specific claims were still worth the trouble of refuting. It also shows how completely Posidonius fused two things later thinkers usually keep apart: rigorous natural science and a fully worked-out ethical philosophy, inside the very same body of work. To Posidonius, there was no meaningful line between astronomer and moralist. Studying the sky honestly was already a philosophical act. Subscribe and drop a comment on whether you buy that link between science and ethics, because next we watch that same philosophy get tested against something the Stoics valued more than any theory: physical pain. Cicero preserves a story about Posidonius that has outlived nearly everything else we know of him. Pompey, visiting Rhodes, found his old teacher badly ill with severe gout and asked to hear him lecture anyway. Posidonius agreed and reportedly lectured on the Stoic claim that nothing is truly good except what is honorable, pausing whenever a spasm of pain hit to say something like, "Pain, you accomplish nothing, however troublesome. I will never admit you are an evil." Cicero clearly loved this anecdote, retelling it as proof philosophy could be lived under real pressure, not just argued about in comfort. Modern historians note we only have Cicero's admiring version, filtered through decades of retelling. Alongside the philosophy, Posidonius also wrote a sprawling history, continuing Polybius's account of Rome from roughly 146 down into the 80s BCE, covering the very century he lived through firsthand. That history, called simply the Historia, doesn't survive as a book either. We know its existence, its scope, and scattered fragments only because later writers like Athenaeus and Strabo quoted pieces of it. So the honest picture is this: a philosopher's most famous personal anecdote comes secondhand through an admirer, and his major historical work survives only as quotations inside other people's books. That's frustrating for anyone wanting Posidonius's own words. It's also exactly how most of antiquity actually reaches us: filtered, partial, dependent on which later writers happen to find him worth copying. We don't get the whole man. We get what Cicero, Strabo, Seneca, and a handful of others chose to preserve of him. Tell us in the comments what you make of that gout story, because we're bringing this whole reconstruction together next, and it ends with the very word Cicero used for him. Here's what should stay with you. Posidonius left behind no complete book of his own, and yet almost every distinctive thing about him survives anyway, scattered across other people's pages. The tides at Gades, tracked against the moon, an attempt to measure the whole earth with starlight, a first-hand account of the Gauls written before Caesar's own, comets and volcanoes studied as physics, not omens. Put those pieces together and one through line emerges. For Posidonius, you couldn't actually live according to nature without first going out and studying nature, carefully, directly, on foot and by ship, not from a comfortable chair. That's what set him apart even from other Stoics. Seneca argued with him for a century after his death. Cicero traveled to Rhodes specifically to sit in his classroom and later called him the greatest of the Stoics. No monument preserved his name the way one preserved Marcus Aurelius's journal or Seneca's letters. What preserved Posidonius instead were the people who kept quoting him because his findings kept being useful. That's arguably the most fitting legacy imaginable for a man who trusted evidence over authority. He survives today the same way any good observation does, carried forward by whoever finds it still holds up. Geography, astronomy, tidal science, ethnography, and Stoic ethics. In Posidonius, none of those were separate departments. They were one continuous habit of paying close attention to the actual world. He is, in the truest sense, the Stoic who measured the world, and mostly got left out of the story of the philosophy he helped build. So here's the question this film leaves you with. If living according to nature really does start with studying nature honestly, what's one thing in your own world you've never actually gone and checked for yourself? Subscribe for the next film in this series and tell us in the comments. The tides, the Earth's circumference, or the Gauls, which piece of Posidonius's fieldwork surprised you most?